Welcome to Industry Focus, the podcast that dives into a different sector of the stock market every day. It's Friday, May 27th, and we're talking tech, trying to explain just how an iPhone winds up in a customer's hand. I'm your host, Dylan Lewis, and I'm joined on Skype by Fool.com senior technology specialist and knower of all things Apple, Evan New. Evan, how's it going?
Pretty good. Good Friday.
Yeah. Right before a nice little 3-day weekend. We will not be doing a show on Monday, listeners, just so you know. So enjoy your Memorial Day barbecues. Unfortunately, you're going to have a Spotify playlist going or something like that. You won't be able to have a new episode of IF to enjoy the brats and beer and whatnot. So we're wrapping up Product Lifecycle Week here on Industry Focus, and we're going to do a little discussion of everyone's favorite consumer electronics device, or at least my personal favorite consumer electronics device. I know you're also a big fan, Evan. The iPhone. And just namely how it gets into consumers' hands. A lot of people, in the earlier episodes this week have kind of followed a chronological approach of the background from start to finish. We're going to kind of do the reverse. We're going to talk about the intermediary that assembles everything and then get into some of the individual suppliers that provide those products and the components to the assemblies. So, Evan, I've seen that estimates that roughly 90% of the iPhone comes from outside the U.S. You think that's about right?
Yeah, sounds about right. I know it's a lot. I mean, very little of it comes from inside the U.S. these days. I mean, they have other products that are made here, like the Mac Pro, but as far as the iPhone goes, it's mostly abroad, yeah.
And I don't know how much that really is different than the component breakdown in the past, maybe in like the early 90s, mid 90s for standard consumer tech stuff. But one of the major changes that Apple underwent really with Tim Cook was this idea of changing from having their own in-house manufacturing, their own in-house warehouses, company-owned, to moving to this contract manufacturing type relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they did that, I think, in the late 90s or so. I mean, they used to make Macs in the U.S. and California, and, they just realized that it was just way too expensive, and it was just a lot of it's also the kind of engineering talent and manufacturing talent you can get now. Because, of course, a lot of people have criticized that they won't bring those jobs back to the U.S., but Apple's defense nowadays it's not just about low-cost labor. It's also about, you don't have as many mid-level manufacturing engineers available in the U.S. anymore just because, as an economy, we don't have as many of those types of jobs. That's not the type of education that we focus on anymore. And there's, a ton of that over there. So including the lower-cost labor, they have more people that are within the specific skill sets that they need to ramp these manufacturing. I mean, I think a long time ago they said you could fit, every single manufacturing engineer within that they would need in baseball stadium, but they in the country you could fit all. That's just how many there are now. But over in China and Foxconn's, they can get hundreds of thousands of engineers within a couple of hours if they need them to make some change or do tweak some processor. So there's a lot of sides to the story why they do it like that.
And this pivot, this decision by the business to go to this contract manufacturing relationship, it was really something that Tim Cook pushed aggressively. For all the praise that Steve Jobs gets as this design, branding, user experience mastermind, this is where Tim Cook's expertise really is in operational efficiency and just running a business extremely well from a supply chain point of view. And so he has really pushed the business to where they are now, where they rely heavily on Foxconn and Pegatron, to name two, as these contract manufacturers. And listeners, just so you have an idea of, if you don't know what this term means, basically Apple doesn't own any of the facilities where iPhones are being assembled. Instead,
they own let me just add in that they own a bunch of the manufacturing tooling and the equipment. So what a lot of their capital expenditures these days are, they buy the actual infrastructure and the gear, and then they put that inside of the facilities that they don't own. So they kind of own a lot of the stuff, and then Foxconn owns the factory, and then they hire the people, and then they operate that stuff. So I mean, their capex is $10 million a year now, which is insane, and majority of that goes to this product tooling that sits in Asia inside of factory facilities. So
yeah, I'm glad you hopped in and clarified there. But largely they're paying these manufacturers to put together their devices and then ship them over, right?
Right.
And so Foxconn is the name that you will hear the most. And when you hear that name, you often think of Foxconn City, which is the company's largest manufacturing plant, and that's in Shenzhen, China. And so chances are, if you're holding an iPhone, if you're listening to this episode on an iPhone, it was put together in China. That on that one campus alone, and I say campus, I mean that's kind of the vibe that you get looking around. If you ever see pictures of this setup, it's incredible. But they have hundreds of thousands of employees working there. It's over a square mile. I mean, they have dorms for employees, its own shopping center. I think they have their own cable network there. And so the executives there liken it to this college experience. I think it's kind of a stretch. But, you have people working like 12-hour days, 6 days a week, putting together iPhones. But that one Foxconn city location is just one of the 12 that the company has in China. And actually, folks following tech might have heard earlier this week, Foxconn announced it automated 60,000 jobs in one of its factories. So kind of going back to that idea of providing some of the tooling, I'm sure Apple had something to do with that.
Yeah, I wonder if they help fund some of that. If they're going to be using those robots primarily for iPhone production, it would make sense if Apple helped them pay for some of that.
Yeah, we don't have firm details on that, but it wouldn't be a stretch by any means.
Right.
More recently, Apple added Pegatron, that's a name I mentioned earlier, as another contract manufacturer. And I think this was maybe like 2012 or so, 2013. And I think there were two big reasons for this. One of them was kind of a diversification to downplay the risk of relying solely on one contract manufacturer so heavily like Foxconn. And I think maybe another one was in a response to the company's kind of increasingly complex, fragmented product offering. They wanted to have that split among a couple different suppliers just because of some of the specialization required to produce the different sizes and models and form factors. So yeah, if you're listening to the show on an iPhone, chances are it started out in a Foxconn or Pegatron factory, most likely in China. And just, I think, a testament to the growth and diversification strategy among their contract manufacturers. Recently, they've added another Taiwan-based company to this list, Winstrom. So just another thing to kind of keep an eye out for. So, Evan, any thoughts on why they do this beyond just the very conventional cost? It's cheaper to outsource production to some of these companies or some of these countries where labor is a little bit cheaper?
I mean, I think part of it is that in addition to the engineering talent thing that I was talking about earlier, but then, Tim Cook absolutely hates inventory, and setting up this model and the supply chain. I've read reports where other industry executives look at Apple's supply chain and they're just blown away. They're like, "Well, we can't compete with this." Because you can order a custom build Apple device like a Mac or an iPhone or something, and you can you'll get the tracking information, and it literally ships from the factory to your doorstep in a matter of days. They build it and they ship it directly to you, and and that's kind of scenario where when the purchase transaction goes like that. I mean, Apple does very little hands-on. Apple's not physically handling the product too much if you're ordering like that, and that's kind of a testament because they still get to book all the revenue and all the sales. And I mean, it goes from a contract manufacturer to a third-party shipping company to directly to the customer. And with that happening also quickly, their inventory turnover times are so insanely high that it's comparable to fast food restaurants and stuff like that instead of $600 smartphones. And I think that's been a huge boon to Apple because that just makes the whole operation a lot more efficient. And it's this huge strength because, again, other companies have seen this and they're like, we can't do that. We can't set it up this seamlessly and streamline to this point where it's just incredibly efficient and direct. I mean, of course, they have to have a lot of inventory for the retail stores and things like that, but they're very good inventory management. They keep it really lean because otherwise, having a lot of inventory is never really a good thing because it just sits there and it risks getting written down if you can't sell it, and if you have too much, and it's just kind of a big pain. And I think that's why Tim Cook has really pursued this path so aggressively. At least one reason.
And to your point, while I was researching the show, I came across this stat that the flip to contract manufacturing took the amount of time that inventory sat on Apple's balance sheet from months to days. So you talk about that inventory turnover, and actually this is something that Vincent Shen alluded to when he did the consumer goods episode of Industry Focus, talking about inventory turnover, that Apple's got the best in the business, and it's because inventory sits on their balance sheet for such a short amount of time.
Yep.
So I think beyond that, there's also a little bit more manufacturing flexibility abroad. I think some of these contract manufacturers are ready to go, and they, can get things set up very quickly. They have the talent in place to, within 2 weeks, really be up and running.
That's another thing because, like, if you have these really big demands and you need to be able to scale up and down depending on seasonality and these other factors, that's another big benefit of this contract manufacturing model is because you can just say, hey, I need X number of units, go build them. Whereas if you're doing the manufacturing yourself, you have to also worry about things like excess capacity, capacity utilization. If you're like, let's say you need to ramp down for whatever reason, which makes a lot of sense now with the iPhone just finally declining for the first time, and but just in general, just having that ability to kind of this lever of like I can increase production at needed without really worrying too much about the logistics of personnel, like hiring, laying off, and which is companies that have a lot of manufacturing footprint have to constantly worry about how they're going to like manage the increasing and decreasing production, particularly when it comes to hiring and laying off workers, which is tough thing to do. And so they're kind of outsourcing that responsibility in a way too.
Yeah, of course, this approach is not without its own risks, right? For as much as we praise Apple's operational smarts here, there are some issues with the model. One of them, I think, namely, is control, right? And so we haven't seen a ton of this, but there is the possibility of quality control being a problem. But I think more when you think about Foxconn and some of the contract manufacturers in Asia, there's always this worry about working conditions, and this is something that has gotten a lot of press in the last couple of years. There's always this concern of working conditions being substandard, of being overly demanding, of overtime being required, things like that. And so that's definitely one of the risks here.
Yeah, definitely agree there.
And then one of the other ones that immediately comes to mind for me is just intellectual property risk too. I think you can't go more than maybe a couple weeks without seeing online, leaked photos of some rumored iPhone design or configuration. And I think that's a byproduct of these contract manufacturing systems. When you have all these intermediaries within the design and fulfillment, it's just bound to happen somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, with as global as Apple's business has become in the supply chain, it's too massive. Like you can't keep it secret. Like there's just too many moving parts. There's too many third parties involved, and everyone wants a piece of it and wants to know. And I mean, like you can easily sell a picture of a leaked iPhone and get paid a ton of money if you can smuggle it out. I mean, you'll risk losing your job, but I mean, for some of these workers, like there's a lot of upside to actually sneaking these things out because they know how much appetite the media has for it.
Yeah, and I wonder how much the company really minds that happens. For them.
Well, I know that they've punished workers that have been caught doing this, like, and it's pretty severe punishment. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I mean, like I mean, because obviously Apple's such a huge contract for them, and if that, and they have all these confidentiality agreements and all these things like that. So I do think that Foxconn does care, and they do try to do their best to stop it. But again, when you're talking at this scale, I mean, all it takes is one person to get a picture or a prototype or molding or something out, and you have a headline.
Yeah. So the life of an iPhone, while it is in some ways it begins at Foxconn or a Pegatron factory, I think it really begins even earlier than that. Before they're assembled there are all of these components that are made by individual suppliers or provided by individual suppliers. And so, I think some people have done very well investing in iPhone component manufacturers. I think it kind of makes sense to discuss a couple of them here that you're particularly interested in, that you think are, worth talking about. So one of the first ones that comes to mind for me is Corning, and they are the manufacturers of Gorilla Glass, which is the glass that is on the front of the iPhone. It's the one that your finger touches all the time, and the one that Steve Jobs famously insisted on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember the story was like he had the original prototype, which had like a plastic screen in his pocket, and it kept getting scratched up. And then like 6 months or 6 weeks or it was some ridiculous timeline before the unveiling. He was like, "Hey, we need to go make this happen," which is again kind of ties back into the whole like engineering talent thing they were talking about earlier, because like they needed to make this change within such a short period of time that you need to have an army of mid-level manufacturing engineers that can put this together and from a manufacturing perspective to actually make this happen. And probably wouldn't have been possible in the U.S. with the kind of talent that we have here. But yeah, I mean, then of course now Gorilla Glass is like the standard feature in all high-end smartphones. So Apple really kind of like brought this thing back from the dead because this technology had been like 60 years old, and Corning had no idea what to do with it because there was no market for it. And then all of a sudden Apple's like, "Hey," and then they created a market for this product, and now I think they're on Gorilla Glass 4, I think, or something. Of course they improved the the glass every few generations or so. But yeah, I mean it's so common nowadays.
Yeah, I think if I remember the story correctly, Steve Jobs said, people are going to have this in their pocket with keys, and the keys are going to scratch plastic. We need to have something else. And so enter Corning, right? And I'm sure they're very happy to be an Apple provider. Although there was a period where it looked like they weren't going to be an Apple provider, right? It seemed like Apple was going to be pivoting over to GTAT at one point.
Yeah, so there was a lot of talk about the whole Sapphire thing, which has its merits, but also has its downsides. I mean, there are pros and cons to switching to it. I mean, it's more scratch resistant, but it's also more brittle, so it actually shatters easier than Gorilla Glass.
And that was one of the problems in manufacturing it, right? And one of the reasons that GTAT did not pan out as an Apple supplier.
Right, and also one thing I'll mention about Corning is that when it comes to being an Apple supplier, because being an Apple supplier is such like a legitimate investing strategy nowadays. But I think Corning, it's like their specialty materials division that includes Gorilla Glass, which is only like 10 or 15% of sales. So Corning's not really a good candidate if you're going in saying, hey, I want to buy an Apple supplier that has a lot of exposure to Apple, because they don't have like a ton of exposure. I mean, the rest of their business is like making other glass products like beakers or science things and like all these other things that have use for glass. So their exposure to Apple is actually pretty modest in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, they are not your conventional tech supplier. I mean, they've been around
Right.
for over 100 years at this point, and have a lot of operations in the U.S. I know they used to produce the glass in the U.S. and have since moved a lot of those operations over to Asia. I think part of the idea there is to just be closer to the contract manufacturing that's happening.
Right. Especially for Gorilla Glass. I mean, it's just so popular in consumer tech these days.
Yeah. So we touched on it a little bit, but can you give some background on the cautionary tale of GTAT and some of the struggles of being an Apple supplier?
Yeah, so GTAT is probably the best example of why being an Apple supplier is really this double-edged sword, because, I mean, GT announced this giant deal with Apple. I forget all the specific numbers since it's been a couple of years, but I mean, basically they announced this huge deal with Apple where they would sell Apple the Sapphire material, whereas GT had historically they always made the furnace for the Sapphire. They didn't actually make the Sapphire itself. So what they did is they would make the furnace and they would sell it to other companies that actually operate the furnaces and make the Sapphire, sell the material. So GT had never actually had experience making the material in large volume. They've only made the equipment to make the material. And this deal with Apple was basically asking them to switch their entire business model to create and sell a ton of the actual material. So Apple would, basically be buying a ton of Sapphire at below market rates. But it was such a massive deal that GT kind of I think they got kind of caught up in the storyline, and they knew that it's sexy to be an Apple supplier, so they kind of signed on board. But even without having much experience in this kind of model of operation that Apple's asking for, because Apple originally said we were going to buy the furnaces, but then they kind of swapped and they're like, oh no, we just want the material, and they set this whole agreement up where they're going to build this plant in, I think, Mesa, Arizona, and they're going to operate it. But Apple inserted themselves in this process at so many points. So you had and plus the deal was so asymmetrical. GT basically took on all the risk associated with this. Apple took on very little risk.
They did provide some financing, though. I believe it was like $500 million
Right.
to
So
build
they
that
basically
facility.
offered to have these prepayments, right? So they had these 4 installments of prepayments of the total. I forget. I think it was like 800 million or something like that. And basically at each there's these different milestones that GT has to hit to get these prepayments. And the prepayments are used because someone needs to help fund the capex of building this facility and making all these furnaces. But GT was going to still be the owner of the furnaces, so it's a ton of money that they didn't really have at the time to just go and do this. So Apple's prepaying them, and they're getting to all these milestones. And what those prepayments do is Apple gets to prepay, and that's basically a credit that they use that they were planning to use as payment for Sapphire later on. So it's we'll prepay you now, then they can use the money to build this thing up, and then once they start outputting Sapphire, then they just start delivering some Sapphire to Apple, and it kind of it's like a big tab. So then they owe all the Sapphire, and it just became such a mess because Apple executives are overseeing GT engineers and like trying to tell them what to do, but Apple has no idea how to do this stuff either. So it's like, why is, and like I remember reading through some of the bankruptcy filings, and it's just like GT's like, hey, we need spare backup power generators because if the power goes out, we can lose hundreds of $1,000s worth of these boules in a batch. And and Apple's like, no, we don't want to do that. And it's like, what? And then the power went out like 2 or 3 times. Like, so you just have this whole mess of like, they're basically like betting the entire company on this deal. Like, it's really not a far stretch to say that, particularly in light of like the fact that they felt trapped by Apple. They felt that they were like completely trapped in this deal, and the only way to get themselves out was to declare bankruptcy, which they did. And I mean, of course, like if you look at the timing of some of the GT executives, they were cashing out some of their stock when the stock was high. When right after the deal was announced, it's like, oh, everyone's excited. Apple deal, Apple supplier deal. So stock goes up, and you see GT insiders starting to cash out, and then 6-12 months later they declare bankruptcy. It's just it's a little shady, and
yeah.
I think they definitely they bit off way too much, way more than they could chew, and GT shareholders got burned pretty bad. I mean, they literally went bankrupt.
If you're looking for a visual representation of how things went for GT, I would just search for the boules themselves online in Google Images, because they have these 100-pound boules of sapphire that are cracked and unusable for manufacturing purposes, because it was something that was out of their competency. It wasn't in their wheelhouse to be manufacturing these.
And now you have Apple saying, hey, we want a ton of it. And yeah, it was just such a huge change. It's like, why would you think you could do this? And I mean, of course, at the time, that's what was leading all the speculation that they're going to use sapphire as a cover glass for the iPhone, despite it being more brittle and all these some trade-offs. I mean, they still use sapphire on the Touch ID home button and as a camera cover glass thing, but those are two pretty small pieces compared to like the front panel.
Yeah, the risk of that cracking is much lower.
It's like, I mean, people drop their phones all the time, and and sapphire's more expensive too. So there's that too. So that's another downside. So
yeah,
I mean, it's kind of a trade-off. It's like, what's more important, scratch resistance or cracking resistance? I mean, no one likes scratching their phones, but no one likes, if you drop your phone, you don't want it to crack like instantly at the same time. So it's kind of a debatable which one is more important. Because Gorilla Glass is better at one and Sapphire is better at the other.
So I think the lesson for investors with GT-AT is, if you're looking to play companies that are acting as Apple suppliers, see how reliant they are on Apple as a business, and see that they are operating within a competency that they're used to being in, right?
Right. It was such a bad deal.
So two other companies that you wanted to talk about, Qualcomm and ARM Holdings. So Qualcomm, a provider of modem chips, and it's the component that connects the iPhone to cell networks, provides that connectivity, that access to the internet. What do you have to say about them?
So Qualcomm, they have a few things in there, like they have some RF modules, but I think the cellular baseband is by far the most important. And Qualcomm has had this like spot locked down on the iPhone for, I want to say 5 or 6 years. I can't remember exactly when they switched. I think they switched in 2010 or 2011. Right after Intel bought Infineon is when they switched to Qualcomm exclusively. And it's such an important piece because obviously you need the cell modem to connect your phone to the cell network. And I think for Apple specifically, one reason why Qualcomm was really able to lock this down is because they have the absolute best technology, and they can support the widest range of LTE bands. And Apple likes to streamline their manufacturing, so they only have a couple of models of the iPhone, and they can put this one modem in, and they'll basically work with any network in the world. Compared to something like Samsung, where it's like they might have 12 or 15 different variants of the same phone with different modems that are set for different geographical regions, for different LTE bands, different, so it's needlessly complex. And Apple just prefers the simpler approach of like, we're just gonna have one, and make maybe they have maybe 2 or 3 models for different geographical regions, but it's a lot simpler than 12.
Yeah,
and
it's a lot easier to hit scale with something that is a little bit more universal.
Yeah, exactly. So I think they've done a really good job in just being able to really keep that spot and staying ahead of the competition. Although there is now talk of Intel might get into the iPhone 7. which that rumor's been around for years, so who knows if it happens this year or not. But they might slowly be starting to lose their grip on it. But they've had a pretty good run with really maintaining that relationship. And Apple and Samsung were, I think a couple years ago, were half of Qualcomm's revenue. So it's a big relationship.
Yeah. And what about ARM Holdings? So they're a semiconductor company providing processors for the iPhone and basically the chip that carries out operations set by the computer program.
Right. So the actual Apple's processors I think are really interesting because you have ARM, which is a British company, and they design the chip architecture and they license, and then they also design how to make the chips. And then they license this out to other companies to actually go and implement and to use. But they have a couple of different types of licenses. They have these kind of stock licenses for very specific processors. But what they also have is an instruction set license. So you basically get access to the underlying architecture, so you can actually really develop on top of what they've done and innovate and really cater a chip's performance to your needs in terms of power consumption, power efficiency, like just actual computing power. And that's what the high level companies do, like Qualcomm, Apple, Samsung. They all have instruction set licenses that allow them to really differentiate their chips. And because before that, Apple was using pretty standard off-the-shelf parts, that were made by other companies. But with the A4 starting in 2010, they put their own branding on it, and they're really differentiating. And then now all of a sudden they have 64-bit processors, which are desktop class. And they've done so much on their chips in the past 5 years that it's just insane. They've caught everyone off guard with how advanced they are, and they barely even talk about it too. In classic kind of Apple way, they don't talk too much about the tech specs of it. They just say it's so much faster because you don't really need to know much. You don't need to know the clock speed or
eyes start to glaze over a little bit.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly, which a lot of people do, and it's a big branding strength that they can just be like, hey, it's just a ton faster and it's desktop class. It's comparable to low-end desktops, but we're talking about a phone processor, so it's still pretty impressive in my opinion. But from a supply chain perspective, it's also pretty interesting because you have this British company that licenses it out to Apple, who's in California, and then Apple goes and they do all their design work on top of that. And then they go and they have contract manufacturing on the chip side. So Samsung makes the chips for them. They recently added Taiwan Semiconductor as a chip maker. So and those are based in Korea, and they're in obviously Taiwan Semiconductor is in Taiwan. Samsung makes some of the chips in Austin, Texas. So you have just for this one chip, which is obviously a very important component, it comes from all over the world, in terms of its own value chain. And they also license the GPU technology from another British company, Imagination. So you just have this wide collection of companies in geographical areas where they have to come together just for this one processor to come together, which is an incredibly important part of the device.
Yeah, the sheer number of moving parts that go into Apple's supply chain is kind of baffling. If you want more of a taste of this, listeners, if you Google Apple Supplier List 2015, the company makes available their top 200 suppliers. And so some of them are within the same company but different addresses. But they estimate that their top 200 suppliers comprise about 97% of the procurement expenditures for materials, manufacturing, and assembly of products. So, that is across all their product lines, but that gives you a pretty good sense of all of the different suppliers that wind up going into these Asian contract manufacturers.
Mm-hmm.
Evan, anything else to throw in before I let you go?
No, I think we covered most of it.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time, man.
All right. Thanks.
Listeners, that does it for this episode of Industry Focus. If you have any questions or just want to reach out and say hey, shoot us an email at industryfocus@fool.com, or you can just tweet us at MFIndustryFocus. If you're looking for more of our stuff, subscribe on iTunes or check out the Fool's family of shows at fool.com/podcasts. As always, people on the program may own companies discussed on the show, and the Motley Fool may have formal recommendations for or against stocks mentioned, so don't buy or sell anything based solely on what you hear here. Thanks for listening, and Fool on.